The SciComm Collective acknowledges the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands we study, write, and record on, and their sovereignty was never ceded. Hello, and welcome to the SciComm Collective.
Different useful knowledge in different areas.
The joy is sharing it, making science accessible.
The ignored final step of the scientific method.
Every different perspective.
Science is culture.
The SciComm Collective brings science and science communication to you.
I'm Claire, a PhD candidate in science communication, and in this episode I'm excited to introduce our Bachelor of Science, who is majoring in pharmacology and genetics, student Felice, who has created a mini podcast all about trigger plants. Hi, Felice.
Hi, good morning.
Before we get into the juicy bits about your podcast, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to science communication?
Yeah, of course. So I'm currently a third-year student, and I'm studying, as you mentioned, genetics and pharmacology, but I've always been really interested in science communication because while I've always had this interest in science, I didn't always feel like it was the most accessible or easily understandable, so I was always really drawn to science communication. And I guess recently, after undertaking the minor in science communication, I've also seen that there's definitely a need for it in regard to making more evidence-based decision-making, so I've been really interested in that kind of side of science communication as well.
What inspired your choice of topic to create a 3 to 4 minute podcast episode?
Yeah, so my podcast episode was all about trigger plants, so I did like a little deep dive into trigger plants, and I kind of framed it as part of this bigger series of like looking at different wildflowers of Western Australia. And I think what inspired my choice for it is that I've not always lived in Western Australia, so when I moved to Perth and WA, I found it so cool how there were so many species of endemic plants and just the scale of the biodiversity here. So I really wanted to highlight one of those plants because I thought, oh, this podcast is pretty short, so I just wanted to do like a little deep dive on one of them. I chose trigger plants specifically because I didn't know much about them, but I thought they were really interesting plants and they made for like a really good story arc in 2 to 3 minutes. So yeah.
What did you find most challenging when creating this podcast?
For me, I think it was definitely the more technical side of it. I've never really edited a podcast before, so I found it quite challenging to actually like piece it all together and find the effects, manage all the volume levels so that it sounded good and flowed well. But yeah, luckily there's lots of resources and GarageBand and apps like that make it pretty user-friendly. I didn't actually really know anything really about trigger plants before starting this podcast, so I think that process of like gathering information and doing deep dives on like not just trigger plants, but like all these other plants that I've looked at that were like endemic to WA that I looked at before choosing a topic, that process of like research and getting to know more about these things was really interesting for me.
Are there any key takeaways you'd like us to listen out for?
Key takeaways. That one's I think like a key takeaway for me would probably maybe be like the sound effects, and like something that I'd never really considered was how you can use sound effects to kind of build an atmosphere. So maybe a key takeaway for me would be like seeing how I tried to do that in the podcast.
You're listening to Wildflower Walks, your weekly podcast exploring the weird and wonderful flowering plants of Western Australia. My name is Felice Ng, and today we'll be looking at some of the speediest plants out there, the trigger plants. Stylidium, also known as trigger plants, are a fascinating carnivorous plant species. You may be able to spot one by its characteristic 4 petals or its vibrant purple-pink hues. Their shape and size often vary, but what sets them apart from other plant species is that they can literally be triggered. When an insect comes close, a column swings out from below the flower's surface, kind of like a jack-in-the-box. This trigger mechanism is a cross-pollination strategy for these little flowers. When the column pops up and whacks the insect, it dusts it with pollen which the insect will carry over to another flower. The column is a fusion of a flower's male and female reproductive organs and can both deposit and pick up pollen depending on the reproductive stage the flower is in. Trigger plants move very, very quickly. It can respond to stimuli in only 15 to 30 milliseconds, making it one of the fastest plant species. They're also masters of precision, often depositing and picking up their pollen on a very specific part of the insect they target, varying from species to species. There are many species of trigger plants, with new ones still being discovered to this day. A key researcher in this area is Dr. Juliette Wedge, whose research focuses on Stylidium taxonomy and conservation. Over the last few years, Dr. Wedge has discovered and classified several trigger plants, including the Stylidium milleri, a large, white trigger plant with a yellow-pink patterning on its undersurface, and the Stylidium sherperdianum, which is part of a group commonly known as boomerang trigger plants due to their unique shape. Apart from these, there are hundreds of different trigger plant species, with most of them only ever growing in Australia. WA's southwest alone is home to more than 220 species of trigger plant. That's around 70% of all known trigger plants. So the next time you're out in nature, keep an eye out for these unique little plants. You can even check out their triggering mechanism for yourself. Just gently probe the center of a flower with a grass stem or twig to mimic an insect's proboscis. The best time to see these plants in action is during the wildflower season, which starts in June up north and travels down, coming to a close down south in October. Thank you for listening to this episode of Wildflower Walks, brought to you by the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation, and Attractions. For more information on specific plant species, make sure you check out the online interactive resource Florabase. See you next time, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow our social media at Wildflower Walks.
So what's next for you in regards to SciComm?
I'm not sure, to be completely honest. So I've just finished all my units in the minor. But what's next, I really hope to get some more work experience in the area and just to learn more about SciComm and how that can look like, because I know that it's quite a diverse space and I really want to learn more about it.
Can you share one science communication or podcasting hint or tip that you have?
Ooh, I think it would just be talk to different people who are in the industry and try to be exposed to all the different forms of science communication. Like with the podcast in particular, it helped me a lot to get advice from people who knew more about podcasting or to listen to well-established podcasts to kind of see how they frame their podcast. And I think those things just help us kind of develop our science communication a bit better too.
Catch you next time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Find us online at thescicomcollective.com. That's com with 2 M's. Questions or comments about today's episode? Get in touch on Instagram at The SciComm Collective. The SciComm Collective is supported by UWA's Grand Challenges Impact Grant.